Have you ever heard of the ugly stage? Because it's a well-known term in the art community and it often describes an early phase in the painting where things are so not looking like the desired end result that it's very tempting to either give up or call the art finished way too early. The problem with that is that it doesn't really encourage a beginner to keep learning and practicing, and paintings will just look flat and boring if the artist even gathers the courage to finish them, because that's a very tough thing to do. And that's why with today's painting, I thought it'd be interesting to show you what the ugly stage actually looks like. And I'll be using this reference photo here. And I'm also going to demo an easy trick that I like to use to quickly turn things around and end up with a beautiful finished painting. So let's say that you have this problem of a painting leaving you feeling discouraged and wanting to give up because it looks flat, boring, and just impossible to finish. My little trick is going to mean nothing if first you don't force yourself to push through the initial phases of the painting and learn to acknowledge the ugly stage as a natural part of the process, to the point that you won't care anymore the next time around because you know by experience that it's a temporary thing that you can fix. And I'm pretty sure you've noticed before how different a sketch alone will look like once you fill it with color, whether that is black ink, graphite, or a variety of bright and cheerful colors. And I'm going to paint a colorful watercolor landscape today, but what I'm going to share applies to pretty much any medium and any subject you would want to tackle. Because at first, take this landscape as an example. It's a common thing to start by blocking in the main colors on the whole piece of art, and that's why I prepare my paints before I even wet the sheet. My example is going to be one of the worst cases of an ugly stage in a watercolor painting because this technique of blocking in the colors on the whole sheet is the most suited here, I think, and that amplifies the feeling of an ugly painting. It's always an option to ease that feeling by tackling the art section by section and finish each section before moving on. But here it would be a hassle to do so, so I'm not even considering it. Notice that the sheet is pretty large too, and I'm painting on wet, and this means that I won't have a lot of time to add to my base layer of paint in one go before the sheet actually starts drying. And for a lot of beginners, this is going to be a setback because their base layer will probably look something like this, which is the peak of the ugly stage. It is not bad, but it's super flat and very far from the reference at this point, and that can be surprising, almost shocking when you're not used to it. It's also common to wonder how in the world you're going to add all the details, all the rocks, all the grass texture, and to let that distract you. That's when the ugly stage can be dangerous. This feeling of overwhelm and not knowing how to add to the painting past these initial colors and turn it into something realistic when now it looks so flat and empty. With experience, I've become fast at blocking in all the colors and even adding the first details like I'm doing now. And the fast way that I do this is to include other colors that I created from my main ones, like the different greens you see here, and also start adding texture and impressions of shapes. And here I do it by tapping the brush on paper and leaving white gaps to suggest remote rocks. I also work on 100% cotton watercolor papers cold press, and that really helps because my paper stays wet for longer and it allows me to get away from the flat, ugly stage of the painting quicker by allowing myself to paint longer. Before I dive into the trick that I used to transform this painting, I'd like to share you can practice this landscape and many other tutorials along with me in real time on my Patreon. I'll add a link to it in the description of my video if you consider joining to improve your art or to just support this channel. And I would also like you to tell me in the comments how you deal with the ugly stage and what you've done to overcome that. Adding several colors to a base layer to make it interesting, or tapping the brush on paper to create texture, or just adding a variety of strokes is a good start in a painting. The real power in transforming something that doesn't look great fast is elsewhere. I didn't have time to complete the parts around the boat with my base layer, so I dried the sheet and I wet it again to apply a second layer. I used the strategy I talked about and I kept overlapping colors into the grass, as you can see, and clearly this does help move away from the ugly stage even more, because now this is starting to look like the photo. Now watch this part about the rocks in the background. I wanted them to look loose, so they don't take away from the boat by staying out of focus. And that's why I painted them on wet. And it wasn't looking too bad thanks to the impression of rocks I added when I tapped the brush on paper. Notice that these rocks improve immediately when I add darker tones of brown to contrast with the raw umber paint that I used before. And now, notice it is looking even nicer when I lift some of the paint with a clean and almost dry paintbrush, because now contrast is even better between light tones, the paper white parts I just got from lifting paint, mid-tones, that's the raw umber color, and dark tones, the raw sepia color that I included a bit earlier. So that's it. Contrast is what gets a painting out of the ugly stage. And to achieve it, you can use many techniques, including the ones that I showed you before and the ones that are coming up. And this is just a demo on wet for these remote rocks, because now I want to show you how I build contrast on the grassy areas and the boat. The difference on dry is that the dark paints are going to show more since there won't be any water on paper to dilute them. And that's a good thing because we want to use contrast to add depth to the painting, with darker and more detailed parts up front and lighter and looser parts in the background. I kept relying on leveraging various paint strokes here to paint all the detail that seemed impossible to get before. And to maximize the results I'm getting, I like to soften some parts of those strokes, and I do that with a clean and damp paintbrush. And that's what makes it so easy to add all these rocks on top of an existing base without making it look like they have been added on. This is also a great example of how to leverage a flat and light base layer to add a bunch of messy detail on top without having to sketch everything. Even in the boat, it's impressive to see how contrast transforms this flat shape into an object that we're able to recognize. And it really doesn't take much work or time there, just a few colors and quick strokes. Along with an attention to contrast, watercolor techniques help, since that besides the colors that we use, they're the ones that create the contrast. I mentioned the addition of various colors in one spot. Remember the different greens in the grass and also the different browns in the rocks. I also talked about brush strokes, also the lifting technique as a way to include paper white parts back into the piece. And now I'm using the dry brush technique to add texture to the boat and make the white part look more interesting. I also use that technique to paint the dark patches of land in the sea. This is still all about contrast in the end, contrast of colors, but also contrast of shapes if we think about it. When it comes to contrast of colors, I thought that white gouache would look great to add some crisp highlights in this painting, but I try to use it a little when I do because it will easily make a painting look overworked, and I talk about it regularly in my videos. That's why in some chosen areas, for example, the light rocks that stand out on the photo, I like to add gouache and soften edges with a clean and damp paintbrush to keep it very subtle. And in other areas, I keep it almost pure, like the rope by the boat, and also the tiny highlights that help us distinguish the bottom of the boat from the grass. I hope this video was insightful to help you keep pushing next time that the ugly stage gets to you and tries to discourage you, because I see it time and time again. Watercolor paintings truly transform in a matter of minutes, sometimes even seconds, like the boat did, by just adding contrast. So I think this video here will be interesting to watch next if you want to see how I leverage white gouache in a painting. Otherwise, I'll see you on Patreon or here in another video. Thank you so much for watching and see you next time.